really exciting opportunity today to hear from Nick Bolton, who many of you will know as the founder and CEO of Animas, the Animas Centre for Coaching. Nick has a career in coaching that stems back to 2005 and opened Animas over 10 years ago, and has since gone on to explore other endeavours such as our sister school, the ICCS, the International Centre for Coaching Supervision. As today's lecture will show, Nick's fascination with philosophy, history, and the human journey has been a fuel for the development of transformative coaching model at Animas, resulting in over 4,000 coaches being trained with us across the world. So it's a really exciting opportunity today to hear from him. Before Nick begins, I just want to share a few housekeeping rules. So please do keep yourself on mute for today. If you need anything at all, you will be able to reach out to me using the chat. Feel free to keep your camera on so we can see you, but do also feel free to leave it off if you are unable to keep it on today. And for privacy and confidentiality, we ask that AI note takers not join today. So if you have a AI note taker, please do remove it. We offer a certificate of attendance to our lectures, so please do stick around after the Q&A portion, where I will share a link so that you can receive your certificate. And that's about it from me. I'm going to hand over to Nick now. Super excited for today. Over to you, Nick.
All right, Izzy, thank you so much. And thank you everyone for being here at this strange time, 2 p.m. We've never done a 2 p.m. lecture, but the reason for it, if you don't know, is I'm traveling. Been traveling for the last 11 months, and I'm currently in Hanoi in Vietnam, which is 7 hours ahead. And so it's 9 o'clock here. I thought it wouldn't be a good idea to do a 3 a.m. lecture from my perspective. I didn't think I'd give you the best. So we thought, well, let's do one sort of in the middle-ish of the day. So thank you so much for taking the time out of your working day or whatever you're doing on your, what day will be today? Thursday. Yeah, Thursday. So yes, thank you very much. This is my first lecture in over a year. The last lecture I did was called Harnessing the Disavowed Forces of Coaching. And in a way, this is the second part in a trilogy. And I'll talk about the third one, which is coming up in February. But all of them are really to do with the fundamental humanity of the work we do. And in particular, what you might think of as the kind of the meta themes of what it means to be human, and how as coaches, as transformative coaches, we work with that in different ways. I was particularly struck over the last 11 months traveling around primarily Asia, by some of the cultural differences that I've noticed, which, having been brought up in the UK since I was the age of 0 to 54, had never really become clear to me until you start to immerse yourself in different worlds. And one of the things I noticed was the different attitudes people have towards what you might call their personal agency, their belief in their power to change their life, or their belief in their power to affect the direction of their life. And it suddenly struck me that so much of coaching is predicated on certain assumptions, which may or may not be true, but nonetheless it's predicated on it. You know, for coaching to have any relevance whatsoever, you have to assume that you have some level of personal agency. If you have no personal agency, what's the point in going to a coach? So we have this notion of personal agency, but then at the same time, we become increasingly conscious of the systems we're part of. And I started to wonder, well, how do those two live in balance, or do they live in balance? You know, what is the shift that I see happening in the West, in particular, that it seems to be leading away from personal agency to a different way of being? And what do we as coaches need to do with that, if anything? So that's what this talk was based upon. However, I'm always aware that I come up with ideas that seem really interesting to me at a given point, and then suddenly, like, the dust settles on the shelves of my mind. And then when I come to do the talk 2 or 3 or 4 months later, I've got to dust off that shelf and try to get it ready to talk about. And sometimes that's quite difficult because the idea has sort of lain dormant for a while. So I've been spending the day really thinking about what I want to say, and talk to you about. Hoping it's going to be interesting. I hope it's going to leave you with some useful concepts. More importantly, though, I hope that it's going to leave you with a sense of how philosophy in general can help shape your coaching, because this is just one idea within a whole realm of different philosophical ideas. The place of personal agency is just one small aspect of how you think about coaching and the fundamental things that underpin coaching. And so what I would love is that at the end of this, you go, well, that's kind of interesting, but I'm even more interested in X, Y, Z, whatever that thing might be. So a little bit about this talk itself, and what I would say is the sea change that I've noticed in the last maybe 10 years or so. When I became a coach, as Izzy rightly said, back in the early 2000s, there was no question that coaching seemed to be responding to ever greater belief in the power of individuals to shape their lives. And, it wasn't so long ago that I'll talk about the myth of omnipotence shortly, but there was a real sense in which people could do anything they wanted to. And I remember studying neurolinguistic programming, and there was a sort of a real kind of this upbeat sense that, wow, if somebody can do something, so can you. And all you've got to do is model that other person. And no doubt you could repeat exactly what they've done. There seemed to be no real recognition of the complexity of what goes into creating outcomes in life. It was like, well, if I just model these behaviors, surely the same thing will come, as though the world is a mechanical, engineering feat rather than this kind of organic, strangely luck-oriented thing. And yet at the same time, as the pendulum started to swing the other direction, it almost feels like we're moving towards a sense of powerlessness or learned helplessness, which really concerns me. And that's what led me to think about doing this talk today. I think about how do we help clients navigate those two different possibilities for thinking about our personal power. Now, just to let you know, I'm going to be talking for around about 60 minutes. No, not much more than that, in maybe even less. I really don't know. I never rehearse these things. In fact, I was even saying to an old employee of mine earlier today on WhatsApp that I'm always scared of these lectures because I never quite know what's going to come out of my mouth. It's always a little bit nerve-wracking for me because I sometimes go down paths I really wish I wasn't going down. I have to try to wind myself back. But so I never quite know what I'm going to do or how long it's going to take. But normally it's about 60 minutes. And as we leave an hour and a half in order that we can do some Q&A as we go. So what I'm going to do is ask Izzy to kind of curate your questions and take them in batches. So as we go through, I might stop and just say, hey, Izzy, any questions coming in? And if I can ask you guys to remember to mute yourself, that'll be great. And Izzy, if I can ask you to remember the mute all button, that'll be fabulous. All right. Now let me turn to my presentation. So here we go. And Yannick, welcome to the lecture, because this has a very strong existential theme, which I know you will appreciate. And I'm wondering, Yannick, and don't worry, you don't need to unmute yourself and say anything, but I wonder if you know what this picture alludes to. This lady, I'm not sure you can actually blow a soap bubble in this manner, but she's done a good job. And this actually relates to a beautiful quote that I came across some years ago by Arthur Schopenhauer, who said, every breath we draw wards off the death that constantly impinges on us. Ultimately, death must triumph, for by birth it has already become our lot, and it plays with its prey only for a short while before swallowing it up. And this is where I think it becomes really beautiful. However, we continue our life with great interest and much solicitude as long as possible, just as we blow out a soap bubble as long and as large as possible, although with the perfect certainty that it will burst. So we know we're going to die. We absolutely know it. Although I remember when I was young, my dad said, Nicholas, there's two things you know. One, that you were born, and two, that you die. And I said, well, Dad, I don't remember being born, and I haven't yet died. So I'm not even convinced by those two. But I accept, practically speaking, it's probably true that I'm going to die. So we all have this pretty damn certain idea that we're going to die. And yet we continue, as Schopenhauer says, to, with great solicitude, pay attention to our life and blow the soap bubble, which has such an inherent quality of impermanence. And yet we blow it and we blow it and we blow it and we try to protect it from popping, knowing that it doesn't really matter when it pops because it's going to pop. And my question then is, if I can get Zoom to work, why? Why do we do that? What is it about us as living beings that make us seek meaning for this thing we call life? Why do we seek connection? Why do we seek purpose? Why do we seek to achieve things? Why do we even hang on to life itself? It's a kind of a curious question if you think about it. No, I was talking to one of my team a few days ago about their faith, and I'm always curious about faith because I've never had faith. I've always been an atheist. I'm very open to other people's belief systems, but personally, I'm an atheist, and that's always meant that I've never had an inherent sense of things meaning anything. I've always felt that life is inherently meaningless, which is a very existential thing. But it doesn't mean it is meaningless if you have a faith. But nonetheless, for a lot of people, and even people with faith, you can still sort of go like, but why am I doing this? Knowing that I'm going to, pop my clogs at some point. And I think the reason for that is because we recognize we have personal agency. We can't deny it. In fact, if you try to deny it, you're using your personal agency to deny your personal agency. There's something inherent. Oh my goodness, did I mute myself?
Sorry, that was me. I was just muting all because there was a few people.
Okay. I was like, I've got to start again. I've got to push the rock back up the hill again. So, where did I get to? Yes. So we recognize we have personal agency, and it's really, really hard to deny personal agency. And personal agency forces us to live. It's so hard for us to deny some sense of agency in the world. The real question is, well, where does the agency stop? What is the balance between agency and force? And I was really struck by, of course, the great myth of Sisyphus by Albert Camus, which, of course, is a myth in its own right from the ancient Greeks. And for those of you who don't know the story, Sisyphus was a character who escaped death twice. He cheated death twice by, first of all, imprisoning Thanatos, the god of death, in his own chains, and then persuading Persephone to release him from the underworld. And in doing so, he angered the gods so much by his hubris that they decided to punish him. And the punishment they gave him was to roll this rock up a mountain for eternity, only for the rock to roll back down the other side and for him to have to go back to the bottom and do it all over again. The whole point of that was the meaninglessness of it. The punishment was its meaninglessness, was the pointlessness. But actually what Camus saw in that, Albert Camus, the existential writer, what Camus saw in that was a celebration, if you like, of the absurd nature of life and the human being's ability to turn that absurdity into something meaningful for them, not something meaningful in the most universal sense, but meaningful for them. And he imagined Sisyphus's groaning, straining body against this rock, every sinew of his muscles pulling and stretching in order to push that boulder. And in doing so, allowing himself to appreciate the experience as an act of rebellion against what the gods were trying to impose on him. In other words, his personal agency was the very act of accepting his personal agency had been taken away from him. His agency was accepting and celebrating that particular agency had been taken away from him. Now, Albert Camus was really talking about the absurdity of life, but I think it acts as a perfectly great analogy too for this notion of personal agency. And if you think about the gods as systems, then we start to look at this whole story in a different light, which is, to what extent do you have power over parts of your life, and to what extent are those powers taken away from you? This was really brought home to me forcefully at the beginning of this year. I came to the Philippines for the first time, and some of you may know that a lot of the Animas team work in the Philippines. And I was super excited to meet my team for the first time. I went to a place called Angeles City in the north, where a couple of our guys work. And one of our team is a qualified dentist from Sudan. And I was kind of frustrated that he wasn't pursuing his dental career. I'm like, you're a dentist. Why are you working for us? It doesn't make sense to me. Until he explained that he couldn't go back to Sudan because of the civil war, and he couldn't get his license to work in the Philippines, and blah, 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 blah. Whole kind of story around why he couldn't do it. And it suddenly struck me, goodness me, Nick, there's so much you take for granted, both as a UK person, as a Westerner, and so on, that when that's taken away from you, you realize there are systems that are beyond your control. And the idea of personal agency and choice and just decide your goals and achieve it is often more complicated than we realize. Now, of course, you might say, well, did it take you that long, Nicholas, to recognize that? Did it take you 54 years? Yes, it did. It did take me 54 years to recognize that. I knew it in an abstract sense. But when you come face to face with it, you suddenly realize, wow, thinking you can set goals and achieve them is one thing, but coming up against the forces that block you from doing that is another. And so this whole talk is going to be around, what is that balance between these forces which constrain us and shape us and influence us in ways that we just have to live with, but also the power for ourselves to impact that. So I want to talk about these opposing forces or opposing dimensions, personal agency and systemic forces. But let me first of all talk about what they are. No doubt you will all understand what they are, but I think it's important to get some definitions here. Oh, somebody's ringing my doorbell. Very strange. So I'm going to go into personal agency, which is the ability to make self-driven, intentional choices and exert influence over one's life outcomes. So personal agency, the ability to make self-driven, intentional choices and exert influence over one's life outcomes. That's personal agency. When we look at systemic forces encompass societal, cultural, familial, and structural factors that influence, shape, or delimit our choices, opportunities, and ways of being. These are the two things which are, in a sense, always held in tension. And I want to talk about the journey that we've been on as a profession over the last 20, 30 years, as well as the last 100 odd years that kind of shaped some of this. And I kind of thought of this as like a almost tug of war. This is an artificial intelligence image that I created, and it's a shocking image for a tug of war because actually they're not tugging at all. They're kind of like leaning into each other. It's going to be a terrible tug of war, but it's the best I could achieve. So apologies for the nonsensical version of tug of war. But nonetheless, this is the tug of war between these two kind of approaches to the human power to change the life. And years ago, back in about 2010, I wrote a blog post called The Myth of Omnipotence, and I was challenging the idea that, which was quite prevalent, I would say, 10, 15 years ago, that really you could achieve anything. And if you think about people like Tony Robbins, they were the apogee, if you like, the zenith of this kind of movement that said you can achieve anything. And if we look at the kind of the journey, you could really say that started kind of the end of the 19th century with the likes of Friedrich Nietzsche and I've forgotten his name. Who's the Danish writer? Anyway, I've forgotten his name. Who wrote Fear and Trembling? It will come back to me. Søren Kierkegaard. You could say that at the end of the 20th century, at the end of the 19th century, there's started a recognition of the individual as a meaning-making force within the world that transcended social norms. And from there, in the early 20th century, was born the likes of psychoanalysis and early forms of psychology, like with William James and so on. So there's this kind of movement towards starting to look at the individual as the real force for change within the individual's life. At the same time, there was a huge growth of industrialization and urbanization, which led to opportunities for people to kind of shape their life in new ways and no longer be the, in inverted commas, slave of the rhythm of agriculture. So there's a kind of shift within the early 20th century, and that really picked up speed after the 20th century, after the Second World War, where we had the birth of the humanistic movement, brought along by people like Carl Rogers and Abraham Maslow and those characters. And there was a real emphasis on the idea of the human being as the supreme force and the meaning maker of their own life. And that humanistic psychology clearly is still very, very, very much at the root of coaching today. Towards the end of the 20th century, and indeed halfway through, but certainly towards the end, there was a huge growth in the impact of postmodernism, which seemed to kind of fracture the idea of any overwhelming sense of direction and meaning, and left that meaning making to the individual at every level, pretty much. Which, by the way, if you want to go even further back, you could look at kind of something like post-structuralism as a representation of that. But nonetheless, there was a kind of shift all the way through to the 20th century towards this focus on the individual, leading finally to what you might think was the popularization of personal agency in the form of the self-help profession, the self-help industry, and the gazillion books on you can change your life and so on, which, by the way, I'm sure like all of you, I've read many of them and they've been very influential on me. In fact, I remember long before I ever did a coaching course, reading a book called something like, I think it was called something like Be Your Own Life Coach or something. It was something like that. It was actually a really good book. I asked loads of searching questions. So, I say all of this without meaning to dismiss it in any way, but I do feel we kind of over-egged the pudding of the individual's power. And of course, it was summed up by an early 20th century quote that we're all familiar with, I'm sure, which is all our dreams can come true if we have the courage to pursue them. And this is the one that I've always kind of, always hear. If you can dream it, you can do it. It's kind of fun to do the impossible. And that was Walt Disney. And I always used to kind of joke about that when I was introducing coaching, because I said, look, I've had dreams where I can fly, but I'm not going to jump off a building. The reality is we are constrained. Now, at some basic level, we're constrained by the laws of science, but we're also constrained by society. And I think it's worth recognizing that. So we can then flip to the other side, which is what I would now call the 21st century myth of powerlessness. Now, clearly, this is not a universal thing. There are plenty of people who are feeling very much like they have power to change things. But whether you would agree with me, I don't know. But for me, there's been a sense of growing sense of powerlessness in which people feel systems are way stronger than they are. I don't know if you know the experiment of learned helplessness, but it was the sort of the positive psychology movement, which started to experiment with rats. And Yannick is on this call. He might correct me one day and say it wasn't them that did it, but I'm pretty sure it was. They would electrocute rats, and they would electrocute them in such a way that nothing they did could affect the outcome of being electrocuted. And what happens is they end up lying down and doing nothing because they feel they're so powerlessness to change their outcome, they just give up. And I've noticed that a little bit in the last 10 years. Now, whether that's because of COVID or what, I don't know. I mean, certainly COVID seemed to be a massive worldwide experiment in how can you create powerlessness in people. But for me, there's been this kind of shift in people's awareness of their power. And I think that's been brought about by our mass awareness of what's going on in the world because of social media and news and whatever else it might be. But there's a sense in which we suddenly see our minuteness. I always remember Zaphod Beeblebrox from Hitchhiker's Guide to the Universe, where he the ultimate torture machine in the whole of the universe is this kind of cubicle you walk into, and when you go into this cubicle, you see your insignificance in the perspective of the whole universe, and it makes you it crushes you. It's the worst torture machine in the world. And I always remember Zaphod Beeblebrox going in and coming out smiling, and nobody can understand why. And it's because he realized how important it was. But it's a fantastic notion that our insignificance becomes something we torture ourselves with. And I kind of feel that's a shift that's happening. And we're seeing it reflected in the coaching world, I believe, where more and more clients are expressing a level of, well, what can I do given the strength of the things around us? However, I want to look at how we can move towards a both and perspective. How can we recognize that, yes, we absolutely are a part of systems, but the idea that we are completely omnipotent and powerful is not realistic. But equally, that the fact we're just a pawn on the chessboard of gigantic forces beyond our control is also not realistic. We have power within that. Just as we have power over our thoughts, we have power over how personal agency expresses ourselves, like itself. Which brings us to my concept of neither gods nor their playthings. Because I think the problem is there is a risk that we think of ourselves as one or the other. We're either gods that have complete autonomy over our life, or we're simply the playthings that have to kind of lie down like an electrocuted rat and give up and let it happen to us. I believe what we need to do as coaches, as transformative coaches in particular, is help our clients explore the paradigm that they hold in their head, in their body, in their worldview about their relationship to their power and to systems. Now, we're going to stop for a second. Izzy, I just want to see if there are any questions coming through that you want to share with me at this moment as a sort of high conceptual level.
Yeah, so I put a little note out asking if anyone had any. We've actually not got any right now. There was one question from Eleanor at the beginning, which I'll ask, even though I think you did answer it in a roundabout way. But what does Nick understand about personal agency?
Yeah. Okay. Well, hopefully I did define that. So at the kind of highest level, it's simply one's own ability to affect the course of one's life. Essentially, that's in a nutshell. Now, if you're asking, what do I understand? That's another story. Yeah, that's another story. And I don't think it's worth going into my particular view because I'm just one person. What matters is exactly what's on the screen right now, Izzy, which is the phenomenal, always the worst word in the world to say, the phenomenology of personal agency. What on earth do I mean by that? Well, what I mean is if you look at the Animas 5 principles of transformative coaching, which by the way are now 12, and I'm going to go through those at the end, phenomenology is right at the center. Phenomenology is simply the lived experience of something. So it doesn't matter what's true. It doesn't matter what you as a coach think is true about personal agency. It doesn't matter what Nick Bolton's idea of personal agency is. What matters is what the person, your clients, their lived experience of it is. How do they experience their personal agency? And how is their phenomenology of personal agency affecting the outcomes of their life? Is it good? Is it bad? Is it indifferent? Is it neutral? Is it supporting them? Is it harming them? And if it's doing something that's not on the positive side, would they like to change it? Do they even believe change is possible? If they do, and if they do want to change, how do we enable them to change? And you all know as coaches, what you don't do is go, this is the truth. Personal agency is in your control. No, it doesn't matter. It's what sense they're going to make of it. So what I want to do now is talk about how we can start working practically with these issues, because I've been talking at a very abstract level so far, but I want to really talk now about what it means to coach at the level of the paradigm of personal agency and systems. And that's by bringing the individual's experience of this to light. You know, many of you might have seen me years ago talk about transformative coaching, where I say, and I always use my hands like this. I don't know if you can see my hands on the screen, but I always say what we're trying to do is bring the client's worldview into light so we can look at it and say, oh, okay, so that's what it is. What within this worldview might change? What's possible for you to change? What are you open to changing? And how is its current fixed state affecting you? And what we're doing with this particular thing is simply bringing up this aspect of somebody's life, which is their belief in their personal agency or their belief in systemic power. And by the way, I just want to be really clear. When I talk about systemic forces, I'm not talking about what some people talk about with systemic, say systemic racism or systemic sexism or any of that stuff. All of that's included, by the way. But systems go much bigger than the idea of those sorts of systemic things. The system is everything that's around us. And I remember coaching a client once who wanted to start a business, and what became so clear was that nothing was going to happen until they actually had a conversation with their spouse. That's a part of a system. So let's really think now about how we bring an individual's experience of all of this to light. So I'm going to share with you 8 areas that you could explore. By the way, there are probably more. This is just what came to me as I was thinking about this. Number 1 is the influences on decision making. What do they believe influences their decision making? Number 2, perception of constraints. What do they believe constrains them? And by the way, that is not that's going to differ from person to person. Like, there are things that I don't believe constrain me that somebody else will think constrain them, and vice versa. So it's about knowing what's that client's experience, what's their sense of control, what's their awareness of systems, what personal meaning do they make of these different areas of personal agency and systemic forces? What are the cultural and familial impacts? How do they balance these different forces? And then inner versus outer narratives within these areas. I'm going to go through each of these now. Now, one thing I will say is we will send out, I'm sure, Izzy, we can do this, but we'll send out the PDF of this slideshow afterwards. You don't need to take copious notes. And of course, the video will be on YouTube in a few days. But let's go through this now. So influences on decision making. What does that mean? Well, the coach could help the client explore what shapes and guides their decisions. They might consider, for instance, the interplay of internal values, emotions, beliefs, and external opinions or expectations, and how these influences affect their sense of choice and freedom. I'll give you some examples of what we might actually ask. And I don't want to go through these one by one throughout the whole thing, but let me just begin to roll them out. When reflecting on a recent choice you made, which personal values or beliefs felt most influential? Whose opinions or perspectives do you tend to consider before making important decisions? How do you distinguish between what you genuinely want and what others think you should do or think you should want? Now, these questions sound like interview questions, and in reality, in coaching, you're not going to ask it in such a formal way. These are just kind of hints for the direction of your questions. But you see how they begin to they start to open up the worldview. This isn't as just like, what are you going to do or what do you want? It's actually saying, what's impacting what you want? So number 1, influences on decision making. Number 2, perceptions of constraints. The coach can help the client examine their views and experiences of limitations, such as time, money, societal barriers, and how these perceived constraints impact their ability to pursue goals. This can enable an understanding of which barriers feel insurmountable and where opportunities for adaptation or negotiation may exist. So helping the client actually recognize what is in their mind about the constraints. So the questions like, what do you perceive as the most significant barriers to achieving your goals? How do you experience limitations imposed by time, money, or other resources in your life? What's it like to feel restricted by circumstances beyond your control? When you encounter constraints, how do you usually respond or adapt? And again, notice how they begin to open up the worldview. How do you experience limitations imposed by time, money, or other resources? Is a fascinating question because it's not necessarily a bad thing. Somebody might say, it's great. Having this time imposition makes me get stuff done. Or somebody else might say, having this time imposition stresses me out. There's no right or wrong answer. It's just what is the system doing to this person in some way? Then sense of control. The coach can support the client to investigate areas in their life where they feel empowered versus where they feel powerless, and highlight how they perceive and manage their capacity to influence outcomes, make change, and steer the direction of their life. A lot of people don't feel in control. It's, I've always said for years that it amazes me, truly amazes me. It shouldn't do by now, should it? At 54 or 55, actually. I turned 55 last month, damn it. But it still amazes me how long people get stuck with the same problems. And it's like, sort it. But, but people get stuck because they feel they don't have control over stuff. And perhaps in some cases they don't. And that's one of the things that we need to be aware of, is that sometimes there really is genuinely a lack of control. But in a lot of cases, not a lack of control, let's say perceived lack of control or a perceived willingness to step into their personal agency. Because, by the way, stepping into their personal agency takes courage. It's much easier to blame systems for your problems than to step into your personal agency and go, like, hold on a sec. I've got some responsibility with this. I can do something about this, and I'm choosing not to because it's more comfortable to blame X, Y, Z. Sense of control is a big one. It takes a lot of guts to own your sense of control. So questions could include things like, in which aspects of your life do you feel most able to shape outcomes? How do you respond internally when events unfold without your input or influence? What personal strengths help you maintain a sense of agency amidst challenges? Or how do you know when you're actively steering your life versus being carried along by events? These are beautiful questions because they really get somebody to think about what is their phenomenology of personal agency versus systems. How do you know when you're actively steering your life versus being carried along by events? That's not something that somebody goes, oh, because ... They have to go like, wow. That's a big question. Let me. They have to feel into that, and that's going to bring out a huge amount of the person's paradigm. Next is awareness of systems. Are they even aware of these things? The coach can help the client consider their understanding or awareness of larger societal, economic, or institutional structures that shape their experiences and opportunities. I would say that somebody asked the question earlier, and I won't go into my personal perspective on personal agency, but I would probably say overall I overprivilege personal agency and I underprivilege the power of systems. That's probably me. But I won't say why or anything else. But basically, I would say that my awareness of systems is probably sometimes a bit lacking. And I tend to be a bit gung-ho with what I think I can achieve in life, which is why I was so shocked, and it really brought home to me when my employee couldn't pursue dentistry because of something so absolutely insurmountable. So questions here might be, which social, economic, or political structures do you notice influencing your day-to-day choices? How do you see societal norms affecting the paths you consider taking? What role do larger institutional forces play in determining your opportunities? In what way do you feel part of or separate from the systems surrounding you? All these questions, again, will bring out somebody's awareness. Next up, personal meaning. The coach can help the client explore what meaning they give to their choices and life events, and also to the forces they feel they have no control over. In other words, just because you have no control doesn't mean it's necessarily bad. The meaning you might give it is like, phew, what a relief. I don't have to take responsibility. So coaching can explore the narratives, values, and beliefs that help them interpret their experiences and guide their plans. Questions might include, how do you define what feels meaningful or purposeful to you in life? What personal stories or narratives guide the sense you make of your decisions? When you look at your choices, how do you find or create meaning within them? How do you reconcile differences between what is meaningful to you and what others find important? Then we have cultural and familial impact. This for me personally, as a coach, I've noticed more than societal. Funny enough, as a coach coaching people, I've noticed that familial systems are way more powerful in some ways, or perhaps they're just more intimately present in somebody's life, and therefore a little bit more visible. So the coach can help a client look at how cultural norms, family expectations, and traditions influence their perceptions of who they can be and what they can do. Understanding how these inherited messages shape their aspirations, roles, and sense of self. Now, when I say who they can be, it's a fascinating question. I was talking to somebody in my team earlier, and I was talking about this book I read years ago called Historical Ontology. Yeah. Historical Ontology by a guy called Stephen Hacking. I'm pretty sure his name was Stephen Hacking. I remember Hacking was definitely his last name. Historical Ontology. And what it talked about was how a given historical period will shape the possibilities for how one shows up in the world. So, for instance, he talks about a case study where back in the 1970s was the first, I believe it was the 1970s, the first diagnosis of multiple personality disorder. Nobody before that had been diagnosed with multiple personality disorder ever. The idea of two personalities or more living inside one person's mind or body. And then within a few years, thousands of cases of multiple personality disorders have been diagnosed. But then at some point, multiple personality disorders was taken off the mental health list of mental health diseases, and boom, it disappeared as a diagnosis. So in other words, there was a moment in time when how you could be in the world was expanded by the cultural, historical and cultural context. And so that's a systemic issue that's enabling somebody to be more or less, or whatever it might be, as a kind of human being. They can be different as well as do different. So how have your family's traditions or expectations shaped the paths you consider? In what way does your cultural background influence your sense of possibility? How do you balance respect for familiar or cultural norms with pursuing your own interests? What messages about success, roles, or identity did you absorb growing up, and how did they affect you, etc., etc.? In a way, these questions are just, there are a gazillion questions you could ask. What I'm hoping that you take away from this is that actually these are very practical conversations. These are not like, so tell me what you think about the philosophical concept of personal agency. No, these are very real questions you can ask somebody. They just happen to take you into a bigger picture of their perception of the world. So then balancing forces, the coach can help the client examine how they negotiate between internal desires and external pressures, and understand how they manage tensions between personal agency and systemic forces, including when to accommodate, resist, or transform these influences. You could ask, how do you weigh your personal aspirations against societal or familial demands? What strategies help you navigate when external pressures conflict with your inner wants? How do you decide when to accept external circumstances versus challenging or changing them? What helps you maintain a steady sense of self as you respond to shifting external conditions? And I'm really hoping that as you see these questions, you're beginning to go, okay, I could see how I can start to explore this. And then last one, inner versus outer narratives. The coach can help the client explore the contrast between their own inner voice, i.e., their personal goals, hopes, self-definition, and so on, and the societal or cultural stories imposed on them, and how they reconcile or differentiate personal identity from the roles and identities that society suggests or demands. I was a working class kid. Some of you know the story, but I grew up in Cornwall. My dad was a scaffolder. My mum was a housewife. And I grew up with my parents always telling us three kids that we could be anything we wanted. We had a wonderful parenting in the sense of they really believed in our possibilities. But in many ways, I was still very much a product of being a working class kid. And so my relationship to money for many years was extremely poor. I was always in debt. I was always broke. I never thought I'd have enough money to sort of have a good life. That was a sort of a systemic outer narrative. And it was only when I created my first business and accidentally made money. When I say accidentally, I really didn't think it was going to do as well as it did. My first ever business in 2001. I was like, whoa, what? Is that possible? And so my inner narrative had to shift in order to accommodate what was actually happening in the world. And so, when we start to think about these narratives we hold, some of them are systemically imposed and some are internally developed. And we can start to look at these things with our clients. So questions could be, how do you differentiate between your own inner voice and the story society tells you about you, who you should be? I don't forget, I was doing some business mentoring once, and one of the group members she just had her head on the desk, like she was so bored of me. Everyone else was really enjoying it. This person had her head on the desk, like she was the most bored person in the world. And then eventually I said something about my parents. Dad was a scaffolder, mum was a housewife, and she kind of perked up. And at lunchtime, she came to me and said, "I'm so sorry, Nick. I wasn't able to listen to you before because I assumed that you had a silver spoon in your mouth and you were just some rich kid who thought he could tell us how to live our life when I'm a working class girl sort of thing. And I was like, whoa, you got me completely wrong. But it's so fascinating how people's story about you will shift how they perceive you and vice versa. And by the way, I used to have a super strong Cornish accent. It was my first ever girlfriend at the age of 15 from Kent, where I ended up marrying. She made fun of my accent so much, I had to I had to change it. So it's funny what then the sort of the consequences of these little changes. So in what ways do cultural scripts influence your understanding of who you should be? Who you should be? You know, it's funny. I left the UK back on 6th of January last year. My wife and I separated. I love my wife very much. We're still in touch, and she's having a good life now, which is great. But I just needed my freedom. But what was interesting was I was like, hold on a sec. I've got the health, the wealth, and the time to live any life I want, and yet I'm living here in London in a married relationship, which I'm not very good at being married, with no kids. So I don't need to be in this place. So no schools to worry about, no office because we're all working virtually. What is this story that's meant I'm staying here? That's why I left, and that's why right now I'm in Hanoi, because I realized I was living a story that somehow I should be living, or which is normal to live as a UK-born person. And in fact, all through my life, I remember thinking I would never leave the UK, and now I'm just like delighted I've left the UK. It's the most liberating life I'm living now, but it took me 50 blinking years to get there. So I wish that a coach had asked me that question earlier. So how do you feel when your personal desires clash with societal expectations? How might you assert your own narrative amidst the external pressures, and so on? You get the point. These are all just questions. Now, I want to talk about the paradoxical theory of change as it relates to everything we've just talked about. And then I'll invite Izzy to come back in if there are any questions. But I want to talk about this first, because what we've just done is I'm not sure we can see it, mate, but hopefully you can see my hands. What we've done with those questions and those 8 areas is we've done this. This is the person's worldview of personal agency and systemic forces. And what we've done is we've kind of opened it up and we're helping them look at it. But now what do we do? Do they immediately change? No. Unlikely. They might do, but more likely they will start to gain an awareness of themselves that they didn't have before. And that leads to what's called the paradoxical theory of change, which was change happens best when one becomes what one is, not one wants to be. And that was Arnold Beiser in 1970 something, 1975 or so. He was a Gestalt psychotherapist and psychologist. And I know that Carl Rogers said something very similar. I'm not sure who copied who. But nonetheless, the paradoxical theory of change says change happens best when one becomes what one is, not what one wants to be. What does that mean? Well, I think it means this. I think it means that first you have to accept who you actually are. That's the first step in any kind of change. Once you accept and know who you really are, what is your paradigm about personal agency, about systemic forces? Once you look at it, you can start to decide if it needs to change. Just before I separated from my wife at the end of, actually, it was the year before, but when I had that first conversation with her, I'd been coached by an Animas person who reached out to me and said, Nick, I'm looking for 100 clients I can coach for free who I'm scared of coaching. Would you be one of them? And I thought it was such a lovely and quite funny thing to say. I said, yeah, okay, I'll be your client. So she coached me for one session. And during that conversation, she said to me, Nick, I have a sense you're a people pleaser. Now, some of you might be going, that's not coaching. That's a leading question, it doesn't matter. As a client at work, she went, I have a sense that you are a people pleaser. Is that true? And I said to her, wow. I said, I really want to say, no, it's not true. But you know what? I think it's true. And I think the reason why I'm not making decisions to leave my wife sooner is because I want to please her. I want her to be happy. I want her to be happy more than I want myself to be happy at this point. That's not okay. So there was something about recognizing that this is who I actually am. So I needed to become who I am first. I had to recognize who I am first before I could change that. Once I recognized that I didn't want to be a people pleaser, it was like, okay. Now that I know who I am I willing to live with that? Is that okay for me? I don't think it is. And of course, if we truly believe in the principles of coaching and everything that underpins coaching, the humanistic psychology, then self-actualization kicks in. Once you start to know what you want, you self-actualize towards it, given the right conditions. And I started to self-actualize towards, I've got to make a decision for my life here. So what we've done is we've gone through these 8 areas and we've explored with them their worldview of personal agency and their worldview of systemic forces. And we've simply let them look at it. That's all we've done. We haven't said, by when will you change it? How committed are you to changing it? No, forget that. We've opened up the hands, and in those hands is the kind of the raw soil of their paradigm. And we're thinking, what little shoots are emerging from that? And is that okay for you? So I'm going to finish on this a little bit here, go to questions, and I've got more to come, but I'm just going to finish on this bit here. So final bit I want to say is that for me, transformative coaches, going back to my hands idea, transformative coaches create awareness to open up the possibility for change. That's all we do. The individual chooses whether to step into that space. We don't. It's not our job to impose anything. We open up the possibilities through exploration and awareness. The client decides whether they want to step into it or not. Izzy, I'm just going to pause for a second, see if there are any questions.
Yeah, we've got quite a few. So I've been writing them down, but I'll try and find them in the chat as well so I can share people's names. Maureen asked, what is the impact of labels on your sense of control? For example, in the USA, I often hear excuses around labels. I have ADHD, etc., so I can't X, Y, Z. As a coach, I don't want to underestimate the importance of neurodivergence. Yeah, I wonder how that influences one's sense of control.
Yeah, very good question. So there's 2 ways to think about this. One is, what is your belief about that? I.e., what do you believe about labels? But that's not really the point. The real issue is, what does the client believe about labels? And is it serving them? If somebody believes in labels and that label serves them, why change it? If somebody believes in labels and it doesn't serve them, are they open to changing it? Can we create the awareness that a label exists? Can we create an awareness that the label is possibly open for removal or shifting or changing or whatever? And can we create awareness that they have some power over that? But for us to have a universal opinion on whether labels are useful or not is really not important to coaching. It might be useful for us. Like, I have an opinion about that. It doesn't matter what my opinion is when it comes to coaching. It might for my own worldview, for me, it doesn't for coaching. Does that make sense? I hope that makes sense, Maureen.
Huda says, can you please say more, Nick, about the paradigm?
Sure. Yeah. A paradigm is simply a set of assumptions, beliefs, values, expectations that make up somebody's, what we might call, model of the world. In neurolinguistic programming, they often call it the model of the world. It's simply a framework of beliefs, expectations, assumptions, values, blah, 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 which shapes how you experience the world. In other words, we all carry around some paradigm of the world we live in. And that paradigm shapes what we see. And no doubt you'll have heard the kind of the phrase, we don't see the world as it is, we see the world as we are. And that's because we see the world through our personal paradigm, and everybody's paradigm is going to be unique to them. Some will be similar. You might say, that person's paradigm is kind of similar to that person's paradigm, but it's still utterly unique to them because it's their lived experience. So paradigm is simply the filter through which we experience the world.
Vera asks, how does cultural and personal context shape an individual's search for meaning? For example, how might a client's upbringing or societal influences affect their sense of purpose, and how can we as coaches navigate these nuances?
Precisely by doing what we're talking about here. Because we don't need to have a view on that. That's the beautiful thing about coaching, is we don't actually need to have any view on any of this. We might for ourselves, but we don't need to have a view on it for our client group, because each of them will have their own view. And our role is to simply allow them to become aware of their view and decide whether it's serving them or not. We don't actually need to have an opinion about their view or not. I was recently, I've been an atheist all my life, and atheism is a paradigm. It's simply a paradigm, or rather, as a part of a paradigm. But once we start to accept that that's all it is, and you accept that I don't know any better than somebody else, then all of a sudden you can become fascinated by other people's paradigms. And so I went to see a temple in Bangkok recently with a tour guide, and over a smoothie, delicious smoothie too, from Amazon Cafe, classic in Thailand. Over the smoothie, she said to me, "Nick, do you believe in ghosts?" And I said, no, I don't believe in ghosts. I've never seen one, and it doesn't really fit with my belief system. I said, but why do you ask? And she said, I have just aware of time, but I'll tell you very briefly. She said to me, oh, it's just that when I was 13, my stepbrother died. He drowned, and he was in a coffin, and all the family were there with the coffin in the room, and everybody had gone to sleep apart from me. And she said, I was so scared. I put the blanket up over my eyes because I'm in this room with this, my dead stepbrother. So I closed my eyes, and as I did that, all of a sudden I could hear footsteps running around the room, running around the room. And then all of a sudden, right up to my ear, the little boy laughed in my ear, and then he started opening cupboards. Now, when I was younger, I would have said, "Oh, you're on the edge of sleep," or I would have rationalized it away. Why? Because it would have enabled me to live comfortably with my belief system. Yes, phew, I can prove she's wrong in order that I can be right. And that was when I was younger. Once you really start to understand the power of unknowing, which is a key principle of coaching, you just get fascinated by that person's paradigm. And I said, wow, that must have been absolutely terrifying. Like, can you imagine what that must have been like for her? That must have been terrifying. She wanted to tell me, like, the experience she had. And it was a beautiful conversation because there was no sense in which I was trying to share my worldview. It's irrelevant what I think. And that's the same with any of this stuff. So how do cultural things impose on a person? Depends. Depends. I've known people from, countries. I've known people from, say, Thailand, who have a completely different experience of being a human than another person from Thailand. In other words, it's like you can't just go like, that culture is going to impose this. We have to meet that person where they individually are, and then we have to allow them to go, oh, so that's what's going on. I've got this cultural inheritance, or I don't have a cultural inheritance. Doesn't matter. Whatever one is true for that person. I hope that makes sense.
Do you want me to keep going, Nick, or?
How many have you got roughly? It must be a lot if you're counting that long. Is he? Are you still there?
Sorry, I went on mute. I'm scrolling through questions because there's a few chat messages that aren't questions, but I can keep going and then we can.
Let's do 2 more for now.
Okay, brilliant. So there was one that looked really good.
That's unfair. Now you've judged everyone else's.
I was doing them in order, and the next one is a really interesting one from Rania. Imprisoned people sentenced to death or in death camps still resist and try to live even though they have no personal agency. Why is that, do you think? It must be a reason other than that which makes them not give up.
100%. I mean, look, I don't know because I've never been in prison. But I mean, Viktor Frankl was in a concentration camp and he went on to write Man's Search for Meaning for precisely that reason. I don't know, but that's exactly what Camus was writing about when he talked about the myth of Sisyphus. It's no different from being in a prison to pushing a boulder up. Actually, it's pretty worse, isn't it? Let's be honest. Pushing a giant boulder up a hill for eternity. But the point is, personal agency is how you experience that in your own unique way. Uh, Everyone's got personal agency to some degree. The question is, what are the constraints on it? And in that case, the constraints are pretty damn big, but it doesn't mean you've lost all of your personal agency. You could go on a hunger strike. That's personal agency. You could kill yourself in your cell if you can find a way to do it. That's personal agency. Then, there are plenty of ways to still have personal agency. You could educate yourself on there's so many ways. And I can't speak about that because I've never experienced it. But the point is, everybody has personal agency. The question is to what extent.
Brilliant. Bringing it back to coaching, Catherine asks, when would you bring these wider questions up in coaching? When, end or throughout?
Very, very good question. There is no answer to that other than the dialogic nature of coaching will let you know if it's the right thing. If somebody says, I want to achieve XYZ by ABC time, and this is what I need to do, and they're kind of doing it, why on earth would you need to bring it up? But if there's this ambivalence, or there's this doubt, or there's this like, I kind of want to do it, but I'm not so sure, then you're like, okay, we know we're in the field of uncertainty here, and that's more likely where this kind of thing exists. So it's just you just got to feel it, Oh, yeah, so those were the 2 questions, wasn't it? Thanks, Izzy. So let me briefly, before we finish up, because as we're heading to the hour, I'm going to talk about the 12 principles of transformative coaching, which is the new version of our principles of transformative coaching, which I've really thought carefully about over the last few months to really think like, we had 5, And I felt they were too broad. And so I've really thought deeply about this, and I'm going to go through them because they do relate to what we're talking about here this evening. So the first one is that transformative coaching is relational, as in the whole thing is predicated on the relationship you have with your client. It's humanistic, which means fundamentally you believe in the ability for human beings to grow and change and to self-actualize. And within that is the notion of personal agency. Humanistic psychology is inherently about personal agency. It's dialogic in the sense that transformative coaching is not going back to the very, very last question there, Izzy. Transformative coaching is not a process. That you don't say, right, by session 3, we will take a look at your belief systems or we'll take a look at your paradigm. It's dialogic in the sense that it's going to emerge from the dialogue that's taking place between you, which is not preset. There's no model to this. That doesn't mean models can't be helpful, but fundamentally, transformative coaching is dialogic. It's phenomenological, which means that the client's lived experience is always the central directing force of the coaching. It's always the most important thing is how is the client experiencing this? It doesn't matter what I believe is true. How is the client experiencing personal agency? How is the client experiencing systemic forces? How are they experiencing their balance? Where do they believe their power is because of their phenomenological experience of it all? It's unknowing. Socrates said, wisdom is knowing you know nothing. And it took me a long time to really, really understand that. And maybe I'm not even there yet, but certainly on the whole, I feel like I'm pretty good at unknowing now. And I really believe that one of the biggest challenges for most coaches is to let go of their knowingness. Once you do, you can inhabit that client's worldview with them for the time you're with them, or anyone, even a tour guide who's telling you about their stepbrother. You can inhabit that world with them without needing to know anything at all. It's emergent in the sense of we're not working in a linear fashion. Everything we're talking about tonight is an emergent process. You cannot, can you? Maybe, I don't know. It seems to me it's going to be hard to work in a linear fashion through these sorts of themes. They emerge. You can almost feel them emerging from what you might call the Gestalt field, and they come to the foreground of something to look at. What is this thing here? There seems to be something around personal agency. There seems to be something about systemic forces or something else. One of my later talks is going to be on the relationship to time, phenomenology of time, because time is so ever present and yet it shapes us in ways we can't often think about. It's paradigmatic. So to go back to that word, it's about transformative coaching is about how do we help somebody look at their paradigm? How do we help them bring it to the light and say, here it is. Is that okay? It's holistic in the sense that we're not only working with the brain. Now, I'm a very cerebral kind of person, as you can probably tell from all the particular lectures I do. But that doesn't mean that you only work at that cognitive level. You're working at every aspect of that person, the spiritual level, the somatic level, emotional level, the cognitive level, and so on. It's systemic. It recognizes and it honors the truth, such a truth that it is, that we are part of systems that impact us. It's pragmatic in that it's focused on actually creating change in that person's life in some way. It's not academic. You're not just going, that's interesting. Now I know myself better. I'm going to go watch Netflix for another hour. No, it's like, what's going to change as a result of that? It's collaborative. It's something where you're working towards the benefit of one of the parties, but you're collaborating on that together in partnership. And finally, it's integrative in as much as you are using whatever seems to work for that client. You're not attached in a dogmatic way to a particular way of working. So those are the 12 principles of transformative coaching. And so I want to come back to Sisyphus to round up. Camus said something really beautiful in his book, The Myth of Sisyphus. He said, one must imagine Sisyphus happy. One must imagine Sisyphus happy. I really love that as a simple way to really think about this. Yes, we're subject to systems. Yes, we're subject to constraints. Yes, we're subject to things that make us unhappy and challenge us. Yes, we're locked up in prison. Yes, we have these things that stop us doing what we want to do. But we can imagine Sisyphus happy because he's using his personal agency, the tiny shred of personal agency he has, to rebel against the gods, rebel by accepting his punishment and reveling in the physical experience of it. We must imagine Sisyphus happy. And so when we start to look at this whole thing, we witness the triumph of personal agency over systemic power. And so go back to Viktor Frankl. We mentioned him earlier. Viktor Frankl said, between stimulus and response lies a space. In that space lie our freedom and our power to choose a response. In our response lies our growth and our happiness. And I want to paraphrase that. Completely copy it, but paraphrase it with this. Between system and response lies personal agency. In that agency lies our freedom and power to choose a response. In our response lies our growth and our happiness. I truly believe that we all have personal agency. We all have personal agency to some degree. You know, personal agency is over how we think. And it's that gap between the system that we live in and that shapes us and what we then do and experience that is our personal agency. And this, as I mentioned at the very, very start, is the second in a kind of a trilogy. And my final one coming up in February is Human, All Too Human. Yannick, you will know that's a Friedrich Nietzsche book, and it's a celebration of personal agency. The subtitle there is wrong. I've changed the subtitle to be about how we celebrate personal agency in a world of fragility. But that's coming up on the 13th of February, coming to a Zoom room near you soon. And so with that, I want to say thank you. I really, really appreciate your time. I'm happy to take more questions now, but that's the end of the presentation. So Izzy, anything left over?
Yeah, we've got a few. Nick, I was going to ask, are you comfortable with people to speak out into the space if that's an option, or would you prefer me just to read the questions from
yes, why not? Why not?
Yeah, we could take a couple questions. So if anyone...
Go for it. If people are happy to do that.
Yeah, feel free to raise your hand if you want to ask a question.
And if there's a question in the meantime, Izzy, you've got from before, let me know.
Yeah, Laurie asks, I love the interweaving of various philosophies into a coaching approach. A personal favourite of mine is Stoic philosophy. Have you explored the use of Stoic concepts in coaching, or are you aware of anyone who has?
I don't know about in coaching. I know that obviously Ryan Halliday has done a lot on Stoicism. I don't know about coaching. There's a really, really great book called, I think it's called Philosophy and Psychotherapy, which you could easily read that book and apply it to coaching. And it goes through pretty much every main philosopher and how their ideas have contributed to coaching in some way. I am fully aware of Stoicism, and I studied it when I did my degree in philosophy. But again, for me, it's like all these things are beautiful. We have to be careful not to impose them on the coaching space, but rather to look at how the client might want to use them. But yes, I mean, Stoicism is clearly a fantastic worldview, and it's super effective. It can also be a quite avoidant way of living as well.
Great. Runa asks, in the world of myths, Michael Meade says believing whatever you want to be and working to be, that is a trade-off with who you are meant to be. What are your thoughts?
I laugh because it's such a big question, isn't it? One that I don't. So say it again.
In the world of myths, Michael Meade says believing whatever you want to be and working to be, that is a trade-off with who you are meant to be. What are your thoughts?
My personal thoughts are I'm not meant to be anyone. I don't believe in the meant to be's because that's my paradigm. For me to have meant to be something implies a world. To me, you could argue with this absolutely, but to me it implies a worldview where to be meant to be something exists. In other words, and where would that meant to be-ness come from? It would seem to come from a force that's external and prior to me. So I'm a little bit more in the Sartrean world of existence precedes essence. I personally don't particularly believe in that I have an essence, but that's my worldview. I might be entirely wrong. I might get to heaven and God is like, what happened to you, Nick? I gave you this blinking essence. You didn't use it, you moron. I'll be like, oh my God, I got it all wrong. That's very, very possible, you know?
Rania asks, what would be the best creative ways to encourage clients to engage with these questions?
Ask questions. People love these questions. I mean, most. I'm like, I can't generalize as a universal, but absolutely, people are hungry. In my experience, people are hungry to really think about these questions at a practical, lived experience level, as opposed to an abstract level. You know, if a client's experiencing a challenge with their relationship, or they want to grow a business, or anything at all, nobody wants to sit back and talk about these in an abstract sense, but they do if it means something to them. They can start to engage with it in a very visceral sense. There was a great book called Third Generation Coaching by Reinhard Stelter, And he really kind of advocates for this idea that coach and client can wrestle with ideas so long as the wrestling is still in service of the client as opposed to an abstract exercise in its own right. Does that make sense?
Annabelle Redaway, I am curious, is there a way you can explore this in coaching using emergent objects of constellating?
Oh, oh. I'm sure there is. I'm absolutely sure there is. I think that'd be a beautiful thing to do. I've got no idea what it would look like, but I'm convinced you could do that beautifully. Yeah.
Vicky, if we think of Sisyphus happy while rebelling and also accepting punishment, is that another way of saying best to ask forgiveness than permission?
I'm not sure it's the same, but I like it. It's something I certainly do relatively frequently. Do you know where I thought that question was going to go? Is it a justification for powerlessness in the world? Are we simply acting as a salve for powerlessness? That's what I thought the question. So I apologize for co-opting your question halfway through. It did a right turn away from where I was thinking. So to answer that question, I don't know. It's a beautiful reframe. And to answer my own question, yeah, it's a worry. I was talking to Yannick recently about, if AI and robots take over the world and coaching becomes a meaning-making process for people without meaning, are we just becoming a tool of the system for helping people survive a chaotic time? Maybe, I don't know. It's kind of interesting question. And could you say that Sisyphus being happy is a way to excuse powerlessness? Maybe.
Molly Marsh asks, when working around mindset, how can we proceed if a client has identified something that they would like to think or believe about themselves, but they are part of a system that seems to suggest this is untrue?
That feels to me like it's hard to answer these kind of specific questions too clearly because it's going back to my principle, it's dialogue. I mean, really, essentially, it's dialogue. So that dialogue could go anywhere. So the first question is, well, how does that person know the system thinks it's untrue? And even if it does think it's untrue, why does it matter? That would be one thing. But of course, it's dialogue. So it's a case of just joyfully exploring these themes until something seems to click for the client, until something just goes, oh, you have that little mini epiphany or aha moment, as they always call it in coaching. You have that moment of like, oh, I hadn't thought of it in those terms. So I don't think there's a kind of a linear way of looking at this. It's just about exploring in the round until something just feels like, oh, okay, that makes more sense.
Petra asks, how do you see personal agency as a driving force to create new systems and the personal agency being the very thing itself, which is the creator of the systems?
It inevitably is true, isn't it? I mean, at one level, all systems come from somewhere, and then they seem to take on a life of their own. If you think about coaching, I was talking to somebody recently about the ICF, and most people don't know the ICF was simply a private company called Coach U, set up by Thomas Leonard in 1990 odd. And at some point, Thomas Leonard decided he wanted to create a regulating body, and he called it the ICF. And now, of course, the ICF is a system that governs how you guys do your work, and you feel bad if you get a certain competency 7.135043 wrong, and you get all stressed about, are you going to pass your assessment? Because Thomas Leonard, 30 years ago, used his personal agency to create a business model to make money from the coaching world. So, yeah, in a sense, everything comes from that. I guess you could also say that systems come from emergence as well, I suspect. I haven't done enough thinking about this in terms of that, but I'm sure systems also emerge from not personal agency. But yeah, for sure, personal agency is at the root of many, many things. I mean, imagine if Elon Musk gets us to Mars one day. They'll have a massive statue of Musk and we'll all worship him, and he'd be like a sort of a god on the planet Mars, and he would have had personal agency that creates a system, for sure.
Johnny Hulbert asks, if the pendulum has swung too far from agency to powerlessness,
Yeah.
do you have a sense of what may contribute to the societal pendulum swinging back to agency beyond having more coaches and more coaching?
More coaches. We demand more coaches. Where are they going to come from? NLS. um, I mean, I study history. I love history. Even now, I'm listening to a history of Henry V. I absolutely love history. And one of the things I'm always aware of is when I get a bit despondent about the state of the world, I sometimes think, my God, most of history is the most horrendous place to live ever. Like the level of violence through history is just beyond comprehension. But I do tend to think things go in cycles. So I don't think it's about more coaches. I think there was a brilliant book called The Fourth Turning. I think it was called The Fourth Turning from memory. And it's about how each generation contributes a different kind of rhythm to civilization. And it has this kind of 100-year rhythm. So there's a war, like a major war every 100 years, because that's the generation that creates that. And then there's a sort of another phase of creativity, the poet society and this sort of thing. Poet society, poet generation, sorry. I think that's more likely to be what happens here, is that human beings can't survive in a state of powerlessness, but they also can't survive in a state of pretense that they're all powerful. But you look through, I was talking to some people when I went to this conference in Malaysia last year, and they're very kind of like despondent about the worldview. And I said, you're all about Judeo-Christian values, but imagine being a Roman in the Roman Empire when Christianity first started. You would have felt the same. Like when early Christians were pulling out pagans from the temples and skinning them alive, you would have been blinking threatened. Don't you worry. So just because Christianity is now the settled religion of the West, don't think it was always that way. So I think you have to sort of recognize that things have a rhythm and a rhyme over time. Oh, that's nice. I like that. I rhymed it myself.
Nina Patani, I look through a lens of embodiment and nervous system responses and find that with the complexities of being human and being part of many systems, it serves to work with clients to help them notice what the felt sense of their answers to these questions are.
Yes.
I believe this is the source of empowering them to do what they can. What are your thoughts on thematic coaching and to shift the paradigm?
What are my thoughts on?
What are your thoughts? Oh, sorry, someone's just messaged and it's. What are your thoughts around thematic coaching to shift the paradigm?
Yeah, 100%. I mean, that's why we have the holistic principle in the 12 principles, because the body is a huge part of it. I'm not very well educated on somatic practice. By the way, I don't coach much at all anymore, if ever. I'm off living my crazy life, but I was never much of a somatic practitioner. I'll have to admit that. I'm very much more of a cognitive person, but that doesn't mean I deny the power of somatics. It's just I just never got into it myself. But yeah, 100%. Obviously, it's an incredibly important piece of work.
Isabella, good name. Isn't imagine emphasis happy a way for people in more fortunate situations to not need to take in other people's sufferings?
Exactly.
To rationalize a way to be able to keep your own paradigm.
Yep, 100%. I mean, that's what I said earlier. You could see it as a salve, so that we're okay with that. We're okay with leaving Sisyphus on the mountain, because don't worry, he's happy. I'm not going to say that's the case. The point is, we each decide what this means to us. And Camus' point was not that we should do that, but that we can do that if we want to, because it might serve us as individuals.
So we've got two more, unless anyone has a last question or wants to speak one into the space. But Petra has asked, did Sisyphus create the idea of the gods in his map of the world?
Some of these questions are great. Yes, is the answer.
Okay, Laurie.
Just be more serious. Obviously, in the Greek myth, no, because the Greek gods were supposedly real. But I love the reframe. Yes, thank you.
Laurie asks, is there a particular book, article, or piece of guidance that you consistently return to for its endurance and insights in your coaching practice?
No, there isn't, but I can recommend a couple of things which I did find impactful when I read them. One of those is pretty dense, but I found it absolutely brilliant for capturing what a lot of Animas is about. And it's called The Psychology of Worldviews. And it's not actually a book, it's a paper. It's a research paper by a guy called, I don't remember his first name, but his surname is Koltko Rivera, Koltko, Koltko-Rivera. If you just Google The Psychology of Worldviews, fantastic paper, maybe 50-odd pages long, something like that. Brilliant. Okay, Psychology of Worldviews and Coaching Relationships. Check them out. They're brilliant.
Brilliant. So there was one more question I could ask from Petra, and then we could wrap up if we've got. Do you see coaching as a tool for us to help create new systems which will make the old dysfunctional systems become obsolete?
No, I don't. One of my biggest concerns with coaching is that it's becoming extremely in my opinion, it's lost its way, and it's become more obsessed by creating change that you want to see, rather than allowing the client to decide what change they want to see. That really bothers me. The sort of advocatory nature of coaching bothers me a lot. I started to see this with the rise of climate change coaches, and then there's a whole raft of different coaches who had ethical positions, and then I started to hear the conversations they were having around, oh, my job is to ask questions that change my client's mind about this field, and I was like, that ain't coaching. That really bothers me. So there's a good question to end on. Thank you.
Brilliant. Yeah, it was a really interesting session, and lots to take away from. This will be recorded, so if you want to come back to it, it'll be on our YouTube channel soon. Whilst I still have everybody, I'm going to put into the chat now a link to the Google form that you can go and access your certificate of attendance for today. So please do click on that link and it will take you to a form where you can access that. So thank you so much, Nick. Really, really appreciated.
Thank you so much, Izzy, and thank you everyone for being here.
Yeah, thank you so much, everybody. It was really, really interesting session, and thank you for coming during your working day as well. That's about it. Thank you so much. Have a lovely rest of your day.